The car was a 1998 Honda Civic, the color of old dishwater, and it had been running on stubbornness and denial for longer than Casey Pruitt had owned it. The check engine light had been on so long she'd stopped seeing it as a warning and started thinking of it as company. A small orange glow in the dark, proof that something in there was still trying. She slept in the back seat with her knees folded, and a sleeping bag from a donation bin pulled to her chin parked in the lot behind a laundromat on the east side of Portland, where the overnight manager had looked the other way for going on 3 months, as long as she was gone before the first load of the day went in at 6. She set an alarm. She was always gone by 5:45. She understood the terms of arrangements like this without anyone spelling them out. You don't make yourself a problem, and the person doing you a favor doesn't have to become one either. Mornings she washed at the sink in a gas station 2 blocks east, the kind of place where the attendant worked the overnight alone and had long ago decided that the cost of pretending not to notice a girl cleaning up in the bathroom was worth less than the $2 she spent on coffee every single day without exception. Casey always bought the coffee. She had learned early that the smallest transactions were sometimes the most important ones. They were how you told people you understood the difference between charity and exchange. $11. That was what she had on a Tuesday in October, and she had it memorized down to the last coin because that was the kind of math you kept in your head when it was the only math that mattered. $11 had to last until Friday, when the temp agency had something lined up for her at a distribution warehouse on the south side, 8 hours of scanning barcodes for $12 an hour before taxes. She had already calculated what she could eat between now and then and had already made peace with the answer. What nobody knew about Casey Pruitt, because nobody had asked in years, was that she took pictures. Not real ones, not with a real camera. She had a phone with a cracked screen in the upper left corner. A crack she'd put a piece of clear tape over because the glass was starting to lift, and she couldn't afford to have it cut her thumb every time she scrolled. The battery was the kind that died if you looked at it wrong. And she kept a charging cable coiled in the cup holder up front and plugged it into the car's adapter whenever the car was running, which was not as often as she would have liked. On that phone in a folder she had never shown another person because there was no other person to show she kept photographs. Not of herself, never of herself. She kept photographs of things other people walked past without slowing down. A pigeon's shadow stretched long across a concrete wall in the early light, so perfectly shaped you could count the feathers. Steam rising off a storm drain in the blue darkness before sunrise, coiling upward like something alive that had just decided to leave. An old man at the Morrison Bridge bus stop with hands folded in his lap like the roots of something old and patient. His eyes closed, his face turned slightly toward a sun that hadn't quite come out yet. A paper coffee cup caught in the corner of a chain-link fence, turning slowly in a wind that didn't seem to be moving anything else. She never filtered them. She never posted them anywhere. Looking was the thing not being seen to look. And looking was, as far as she could tell, the one practice the system had never found a way to take from her. She had learned early that looking was safer than hoping. Hoping left you open in ways that cost too much. When she was 9 years old, a family had almost kept her. They had a house in northeast Portland with a backyard and a golden retriever named Fletcher, and a mother who braided Casey's hair on Sunday mornings, sitting her between her knees on the bathroom floor, working through the tangles with a wide-toothed comb and humming something Casey never learned the name of. The mother called her sweetheart in a voice that sounded like she meant it every single time. Not like a word you throw at a child the way you throw a coat over something you don't want to look at. Like a word she had chosen specifically. Casey had let herself believe it. That was the mistake. 8 months in, the mother found out she was pregnant. It was good news, the caseworker explained later. Good news for the family. Casey understood that this made it a complicated category of news for her, but the caseworker seemed to feel that explaining the first part covered the obligation, so she left it there. A few weeks after the baby came home from the hospital, a different caseworker arrived at the front door with a clipboard and a practiced expression of gentle regret, and Casey was driven back to the group home on Burnside with her clothes in a black garbage bag on the seat beside her. Nobody was cruel about it. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody said anything that could be pointed to later as evidence of wrongdoing. They had simply changed their minds the way people are allowed to change their minds about things that belong to them. And Casey had only ever been on loan. After that, she stopped unpacking, not just the bag, all of it. She stopped arranging the room, stopped learning the names of the other kids, faster than necessary, stopped eating breakfast as if the table would still be there next month. She learned to travel light in the way that has nothing to do with luggage. She had been in the system for 11 years when the file closed, and the world handed her a bus pass and a pamphlet about transitional housing resources and wished her luck. She was still looking for luck when October came in cold off the Columbia, and the night started seeping up through the floor of the Civic, and she started wearing her second pair of socks to bed. The storage place was on an industrial stretch of southeast Portland, near the rail yards, a sprawl of orange roll-up doors behind a chain-link fence with a banner across the front entrance that said, Key Point Self-Storage, in letters faded to the color of old mustard. Under that, on a piece of white board that someone had written on by hand, now hiring inquire inside. Casey had driven past it twice before she pulled in. She wasn't sure what she expected, but a job was a job, and the temp agency work was the kind of thing you couldn't count on and couldn't budget around. And she had a fake permanent address memorized from a utility bill she'd found in the recycling bin outside a laundromat 2 months ago. The same address she put on every application, because an application without a permanent address was a piece of paper people set aside and forgot about. She knew this from experience. The front office smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. The man behind the counter was heavy-set and tired in a comfortable way, the kind of tired that has been there long enough to stop fighting. He had reading glasses pushed up into thinning gray hair and a ceramic mug on the desk in front of him that said, World's Okayest Boss in block letters, and from the way he was holding it, the coffee had gone cold a while ago, and he hadn't gotten around to caring. His name tag said Lyle. He looked at Casey's application for a long moment. Then he looked at her face, then back at the application, specifically at the line for permanent address. She had filled it in with the calm confidence of someone who had practiced this, and she held his gaze the way she had learned to hold things like this level and without apology. Lyle Dutton set the application on top of a stack of other applications and folded his hands over his mug. He did not look unkind. He looked like a man who had made certain kinds of decisions so many times that they had stopped requiring a lot of him. We'll keep it on file, he said, which is what people say when they mean no. Casey nodded and gathered her bag and turned toward the door. She had made it 3 steps when she heard the sound of something sliding across the counter. She turned. Lyle was looking at the far wall, the same way a person looks at the wall when they want to make clear they are not watching what they're doing. On the counter where Casey had been standing was a small paper ticket, white with a red border. A number was printed on it in black ink. Doing a giveaway, Lyle said to the wall. Customer appreciation thing. Drawings at noon. Grand prize is a whole storage unit, contents and all. He picked up his cold coffee. People seemed to like the idea of it. Casey stood there a moment looking at the ticket. What's in the unit? She asked. Couldn't tell you. Lyle set the mug back down. Old woman stopped paying on it a couple years back. Passed away sometime after. Paperwork says no family came around. Place is full of her things. He pushed his glasses down onto his nose and looked at the stack of forms on his desk. Probably junk, but people like the idea of treasure. Casey picked up the ticket. She almost didn't stay. The drawing wasn't for 2 hours, and 2 hours was a long time when you were running on gas station coffee and $11, and the particular background hum of having nowhere to be, but no comfortable way of being nowhere. But the office was warm, and there was a folding table against the wall with a cardboard box of donuts and a carafe of coffee that was at least still producing heat, and she had nowhere in particular to be until the world went dark again. So she stayed. By noon, there were maybe 30 people clustered in the lot around a wheelbarrow someone had filled with raffle tickets. Most of them were professional about it. Men in work boots with pickup trucks backed up to the fence, the kind who bought abandoned units for a living and had developed the ability to estimate the value of someone's whole life from the smell coming through a crack in the door. They talked among themselves in a low, comfortable way, the way people talk when they already belong to a thing. They ignored Casey the way you ignore a parking meter, completely without effort because she had already been categorized. She stood at the edge of the group with her ticket folded in her fist and her hood up and her back to the fence and watched the donut box get depleted. Lyle came outside and climbed onto a step stool with a slip of paper in his hand. He reached into the wheelbarrow without looking and pulled out a ticket and squinted at it. 417, he said. The lot went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when everyone is checking something. Casey unfolded her ticket. The numbers swam for a second before they settled into themselves. 4, 1, 7. She said it first to herself silently just to be sure. Then she said it out loud and her voice came out smaller than she intended, barely clearing the distance between them. That's me. Lyle looked over. Come again. 417. She held up the ticket. That's me. A ripple moved through the group of men, the way a ripple moves through water when you drop something into it. Not violent, just a disturbance of the surface, a rearrangement. Someone laughed a short bark of sound that was not entirely unkind, the kind of laugh that is really just surprise looking for somewhere to go. A man in a Carhartt jacket muttered something to the man beside him. A woman who had been standing apart from the truck men said loud enough to carry, "Hope you got a moving van, honey." And a few people found this funny. Casey felt her face go hot under the hood. She was aware the way she was always aware of the donation bin coat and the gas station smell and the cracked phone in her pocket. She was aware that the $11 was somehow visible, the way poverty is visible, even when none of its evidence is on display, as if it produces a frequency other people can pick up without quite knowing what they're receiving. She walked up to Lyle and took the padlock key and the clipboard he held out. He looked almost apologetic. He lowered his voice. Unit 44, last row far end. You've got 48 hours to clear it out. After that, it reverts to us. He paused. Just so you know, going in. Casey looked at the key in her hand. Clear it out to where, she said. It wasn't really a question. It was just the truth said out loud, which was its own kind of relief. Lyle didn't have an answer for that. He had the decency to know he didn't have one. Unit 44 was at the far end of the last row where the security lights didn't quite reach, and weeds had pushed up through the cracks in the asphalt like they owned the place and had been patient about it. The padlock was stiff with rust. Casey worked the key until the mechanism gave with a sound like a complaint, and then crouched and hauled the roll-up door on its track, and it groaned the whole way, every inch of the way, as if it had been holding its breath, and this was not the breath it wanted to let out. The smell came first, mildew and dust and paper that had been sitting in its own stillness for years. The breath of a room that has been keeping something for a very long time. Then the sight of it. The unit was packed to the ceiling. It was a solid wall of someone's entire life, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, with no system to it and no mercy. Cardboard boxes gone brown and soft at the corners, sagging into each other. Some of them burst open at the bottom under the weight of whatever had been stacked on top. A dresser tipped on its side with two drawers missing the wood, warped and gray. A rolled rug eaten through in a long stripe down the middle. Stacks of magazines fused together by old damp into single yellow bricks that would never separate again without tearing. A standing lamp with no shade. A crate of dishes chipped and filmed with dust. A sewing basket spilling spools across the floor, the thread gone brittle and colorless. And over everything, a gray film that settled on your hands the moment you touched anything. The particular dust of time that accumulates in closed rooms where no one has opened a window and the light has not moved in years. Casey stood in the doorway and let the small, foolish hope she hadn't known she was carrying go quietly flat inside her chest. It's just stuff, she said out loud to no one. Of course it is. She did the math the way she always did the math. Even if she could get it out, even if she could find a way to move a dead stranger's furniture across a city, She crossed on foot, and by bus she had nowhere to take it. You cannot load a sofa into the back seat of a Civic you sleep in. The things that were heavy were the things worth anything, and the things that were light were ruined. It was a prize that had been designed without anyone meaning to design it this way, to be useless to someone in her exact position. Still, 48 hours. She had the time and nothing to do with it except wait for dark, so she started sorting. She worked her way in from the doorway, lifting box flaps, pressing her hand against the sides to test whether they'd hold. Most of them came apart as she moved them. The magazines were fused and ruined. The dishes were chipped past anything a pawnshop would consider. A box of clothes had gone entirely to mold a dark, blooming thing that had consumed the fabric so thoroughly, there was no separating what was cloth from what was wrought. Another box held nothing but a tangle of electrical cords, orphaned from whatever they had once powered. She found a shoebox of greeting cards near the middle of the stack. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, a few Easter cards. She lifted the lid and fanned through them. The oldest ones were thick in warm handwriting that ran all the way to the back of the card and then turned sideways along the margin to fit in one more thing. The words were the words of people who had a lot to say to each other. As the dates moved toward the present, the cards got shorter. The messages got smaller. The handwriting changed as the people who had held the pens aged and then one by one did not write anymore. Near the top of the stack, the cards were barely cards at all. A dentist's reminder about an upcoming cleaning. A renewal notice for a dog license made out to a name Casey did not recognize at an address she had never heard of. Whoever this woman had been, the world had written to her less and less the longer she lived, until it nearly stopped. Casey closed the shoebox and set it to one side very carefully because some things you do not dig through. They are not yours to dig through. They are just the evidence of a life, and evidence deserves to be handled with a little restraint. Somewhere in the middle of the second hour, she stopped feeling like she was scavenging and started feeling like she was trespassing. This had been someone's, all of it, paid for and transported and arranged, or at least piled by hands that had cared enough to keep it. And the keeping had continued long past the point of sense, the way keeping always does, when the things you're keeping stand for something that isn't the things themselves. "I'm sorry," she found herself murmuring as she moved a hat box. "Sorry, I'm sorry." The light outside was going amber by the time she made it to the back wall. Her keep pile near the door was small and a little sad. A silver-plated picture frame, badly tarnished but real. A glass paperweight with a dandelion seed head suspended inside it, somehow uncracked despite everything around it. A pocket knife with a bone handle that felt solid when she pressed it in her palm, the weight of something made to last. $12 of stuff if a pawn shop was feeling generous, which in Casey's experience, pawn shops never were. She was wiping her hands on her jeans, working up to the decision she had known was coming since the moment she opened the door when she saw it. The footlocker. It sat against the back wall, under the worst of the water staining half hidden behind the toppled dresser. Military green gone to gray metal corners, a hasp that had rusted but not locked. Someone had stacked things on top of it over the years, and the topmost thing sitting square in the center of the lid, like it had been placed there on purpose, was a camera. Casey went still. It was not a phone. It was not the flat black plastic kind of camera she'd seen in thrift store bins for $3 in a layer of mold on the lens. It was a boxy thing heavier than it looked when she lifted it, with two round glass lenses stacked one on top of the other on the front, and a hood on top that folded open so you looked down into it instead of holding it up to your eye. The glass underneath the dust was clean and deep, and had the look of something that had been cared for by someone who understood what they were looking at. A name was stamped on the front. In worn silver letters, she had to tilt the camera toward the fading light to read. She turned it slowly in her hands. In the failing light coming through the open door, she caught her own face reflected upside down in the upper lens, small and curious, and something in her chest that she'd kept folded up and stored away for a very long time shifted just slightly. Half an inch. Like a door that has been stuck a long time and finally moves not all the way, just enough to feel the air on the other side. "Well," she said softly. "Hello." She set the camera down on top of the footlocker with more care than she'd handled anything all day, and she opened the hasp and lifted the lid. Not tools. She had half expected tools. Men who kept their whole lives in storage units kept tools. It was full of film. Flat, round tins of it stacked in rows. Each one labeled along the edge in pencil in a small, careful hand, a date and a few words. The dates went back decades. The words were brief and unhelpful in the best possible way. The kind of notes someone makes for themselves because they know what they mean and never consider that someone else might need to understand them later. There were thick paper envelopes swollen with what felt like more film inside, and flat manila folders in a bundle of cloth-covered books tied together with kitchen string. When Casey lifted one of the folders, glossy sheets slid out. Contact sheets, she would learn the name for them later, but what she saw now was what they were. Dozens of tiny photographs printed in grids on a single page. Each image no bigger than a postage stamp. Hundreds of small black and white windows arranged in rows. The whole visible record of a roll of film shrunk to the size of a hand. And loose on top of everything where it must have slid or been placed when someone closed the lid for the last time was a single full-size print. Casey picked it up and held it toward the last of the light. It was a city street in the rain. An ordinary corner. A crosswalk. A man in a hat hurrying through a puddle with his coat collar turned up. That was all it was on the surface. But the rain had been caught mid-fall, every drop frozen in the air as a silver thread, and the puddle held the whole gray sky in it, and the man's face half turned as he moved wore an expression so entirely private, so completely his own, that Casey felt she had no business seeing it. It was the loneliest, most alive thing she had ever looked at. The hair stood up on her arms under her coat. She had taken 1,000 photographs on a cracked phone of things other people walked past without slowing, and she had never once caught this. She had chased this exact quality of stillness and aliveness in the same frame, and it had always moved just out of reach. And here it was, in a storage unit full of ruined furniture, in the last row where the security lights didn't reach. Caught by someone who had been standing on a street corner in the rain with this heavy camera and this eye and this patience. She turned the print over. On the back in pencil, in the same small, careful handwriting as the labels on the film tins. He didn't know I was there. They never do. Casey stood in the open doorway with the light dying around her and the rest of the unit going to shadow and the print in her hands. From somewhere down the row, very far away, she heard Lyle Dutton's voice calling that they were locking the gate. She looked at the wall of ruined boxes she could not move. She looked at the footlocker. She didn't decide so much as discover she had already decided. She set the print down on top of the camera, crouched, and worked her arms under the metal corners of the footlocker to test the weight. Heavy, but carryable. If she rested twice, she could make it the length of the row. She zipped the camera inside her coat against her chest. She tucked the print inside the cover of the topmost cloth-covered book. She left the silver frame and the paperweight and the bone-handled knife in their little pile on the floor, because next to the footlocker, they had stopped mattering. She paused at the threshold and looked back at everything that would remain. The dresser and the lamp and the shoebox of cards, signed by people who were also gone now. All of it going back into the dark it had been waiting in for so long. "I'll come back for the other boxes," she said. "I will." She believed it when she said it. She had no way of knowing yet how much she would need to. She carried the footlocker out under the orange lights, resting once against a roll-up door and once against the fence, and wrestled it into the trunk of the Civic. The trunk only closed if you slammed it twice, which she did. Lyle watched from the office doorway with his okayest boss mug in his hand and didn't offer to help and didn't quite meet her eyes and raised one hand in a wave as she pulled out through the gate. She drove to the laundromat lot and killed the engine, climbed into the back seat with the single loose print and the camera and the dome light, which was the one light in the car that still worked. She picked up the camera and turned it over in her lap. On the base plate, scratched into the metal with something sharp, were two small initials worn nearly smooth by a thumb that must have rubbed that same spot 10,000 times. R and C. Not a brand, a person. The woman had marked the camera the way a child marks a lunchbox, so everyone would know it was hers, except there had been no everyone. Only her and the camera and whatever she pointed it at. It was full dark now. The laundromat hummed behind her. Somewhere a dog was barking and giving up and barking again. Casey held the print under the yellow dome light and looked at the man in the rain until her eyes burned, then turned it over again to read the handwriting one more time. He didn't know I was there. They never do. Sleep came eventually and then left before morning. Casey lay in the cold car with the sleeping bag pulled to her chin and the footlocker in the trunk, and thought about what it would mean to be so practiced at disappearing that your whole life's work existed in the margins of other people's attention. She thought about a person who had decided at some point that the state of being unseen was not a wound to press on, but a position from which you could see everything. She thought about her own cracked phone and its folder of steam and shadows and old men at bus stops. In the morning, she had the problem of the film. Sealed in those tins, it was nothing to her. She knew that much. Film had to be developed, and developing cost money, and money was the $11 that was now $9 after she'd put $3 of gas in the tank just to have heat for an hour. She turned the problem over while she washed her face at the gas station sink, replaying options with the methodical patience of someone who has had to solve problems with very limited resources for a very long time. She could sell the camera. It was old and it was real, and even she could see it was worth something. If she sold it, she could pay to develop a roll or two and find out what she'd been carrying around. And what she was carrying around might be nothing. Probably was nothing. Most things turned out to be nothing. But she thought about the man in the rain, the way that print had made her feel in the failing light of Unit 44, like someone had managed to reach out of a rainy street on some ordinary day decades ago and grab her by the collar. She kept the camera and looked for a place that still did film. It took most of the morning. 3 phone calls, 2 wrong addresses, 1 shop that had converted to digital 6 years ago and still had the word film on the sign out of what appeared to be nostalgia. The 4th result on her internet search was a listing so sparse it had no reviews and no photos and no hours posted, just a name and an address on a block she didn't know near the city center. Cameras and Company, between a vape store and a shuttered bakery with plywood over the windows. A hand-painted sign, a display window packed so densely with equipment lenses and bellows and light meters, and cases stacked on cases that she had to press close to the glass to see anything. And even then, it looked less like a shop than a very organized version of what she had just spent a day sorting through. A bell announced her when she pushed the door open. Inside, it was narrow and warm and smelled of something chemical underneath the dust, sharp and clean like the air inside a dark room, which of course she had never smelled before, but would recognize instantly when she encountered it properly. Every surface was occupied. Cameras on shelves behind glass, boxes of filters and lens caps and spare parts she couldn't have named, a rack of straps, a wall of trays and chemicals and brown bottles, an entire display case of light meters going back what looked like 80 years. Behind the counter on a stool sat a man who could only be described as large in the permanent settled way of someone who had stopped fighting it. Gray beard, reading glasses on a chain around his neck, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He was doing something very precise to the internal mechanism of a small camera with a jeweler's screwdriver no bigger than a toothpick, and he did not look up when the bell rang. "If it's a phone," he said, "I don't fix phones." "It's not a phone," Casey said. She set the twin lens camera on the glass counter between them. That made him look up. The screwdriver went down. His hands went still. He sat for a moment looking at the camera the way certain people look at certain things, with a quality of recognition that goes deeper than just identifying the object. Then slowly he pushed the glasses up onto his nose and looked at Casey. "May I?" "It's mine," she said too fast because she had learned to say that before anyone had the chance to decide otherwise. "I don't doubt it." He lifted the camera from the counter with both hands, the way you lift something fragile, cradling the body of it in his palms. He turned it slowly, thumbed the focus knob, clicked the hood open, and looked down through the viewing glass. He was quiet for a long moment. Twin lens, he said finally, mostly to himself. German. They stopped making this model around the time my father stopped making sense. He tilted the camera toward the light. His mouth moved slightly as if running through something in his head. He set it down on a square of felt he produced from somewhere under the counter. Then he looked at Casey again properly this time. Where does a girl your age get a camera worth more than the car she came in with? Casey felt her stomach tighten in the old familiar way, the way it tightened when a conversation was about to reach the part where a door got pointed at. He had seen the Civic through the window. He had seen all of her in the 10-second assessment people make of a person when they have decided they need to know what kind of situation they are dealing with. She kept her voice level. She said it the way she had learned to say true things without apology and without elaboration. I won it, she said, in a raffle, storage place on the east side. They had a whole unit of an old woman's things, and this was in it. She met his eyes. I want to sell it. I need to pay for developing some film, and I don't have the money. The man was quiet for a moment. Then he set the camera down on the felt square and looked at it for another moment, and then he looked back at her. Name's Clem Harwick, he said. I've had this shop 40 years, and I'll tell you the truth because I don't see the use in the other thing. He folded his arms across his chest. I could give you $60 for that camera and turn around and sell it for $400 tomorrow, and you'd never know the difference. His eyes held hers steady and without cruelty. And I'd feel like garbage every single time I walk past the spot where it used to sit. So I'm not buying your camera. He reached under the counter without looking away. What film? Casey had not expected that. She stood for a second without saying anything, recalibrating. She reached into her bag and pulled out one of the manila folders, laid it on the counter and slid the contact sheet out the grid of postage stamp images, black and white, dense with small captured moments. She set it in front of Clem Harwick. He looked down at it. He didn't say anything. He reached into a drawer without taking his eyes off the sheet and produced a loupe, a small magnifying lens, and bent over the contact sheet with it. He moved it to the first frame, held it, moved it to a second frame, a third. He worked his way slowly across the sheet. The shop was quiet around them. The refrigerator compressor in the back kicked on and then off again. Somewhere outside on the street, a truck downshifted. When Clem straightened up, he took the glasses all the way off and set them on the counter. His eyes were wet. He looked briefly angry about it, the way a person looks angry when something has reached them unexpectedly and they haven't yet decided what to do with the fact of being reached. Who shot this? He said. I don't know, Casey said. An old woman. She died. Nobody claimed her things, which is why I got the unit. She hesitated, then said what she'd been turning over since the night before in the back seat of the Civic. Is it good? Clem Harwick looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed a short, surprised sound and rubbed one hand down through his beard. Good, he repeated as if testing the word for structural integrity and finding it insufficient. Kid, I look at photographs all day long. People bring me their weddings and their vacations and their dogs and their grandchildren, and 9 times in 10 what they've got is a snapshot. And that's fine. Snapshots are what most of life is. He put his hand flat on the contact sheet. This is not that. Whoever took this wasn't taking pictures. He looked at the small frames under his hand. She was keeping the world from getting away. He said he would develop a role. He said it the way a man says something he has already decided and is now just informing you of. They picked one of the tins, almost at random, one with a pencil date from decades back, and Clem disappeared behind a black curtain at the back of the shop, and Casey heard water running and the small clink of him working in the dark. It took the better part of an hour. She stood in the cluttered front of the shop and looked at the antique cameras in their cases and looked at her own reflection in the glass of the display case and waited. She thought about patience. She had a lot of it. Patience was not a virtue when you grew up the way she did. It was a survival mechanism. You waited for placements, for hearings, for caseworkers to call back, for the next thing that was either going to be okay or not okay, and there was nothing you could do in the waiting to make it go one way or the other. When Clem came back and through the curtain, He was carrying a strip of negatives by the edges, and his hands were not entirely steady. He clipped the strip to a light box on the counter and bent over it with the loop again. This time he was quiet for a very long time. Then he turned the loop around and pushed the light box toward Casey. "Look," he said. She looked. Children playing in the spray of an open fire hydrant on a hot street caught at the half second their faces pure and unguarded and full of a joy so complete it had no room left in it for anything else. A woman in a fur coat and a man in rags sharing a park bench in the exact same posture, shoulders curved, hands loose, both of them staring at something that wasn't there, not looking at each other, but making one shape together that they didn't know they were making. A small girl pressing her whole face against a bakery window, hands flat on the glass on either side of her head, breath fogging the pain. An old man asleep on a stoop with a newspaper open across his chest, like a blanket, his mouth slightly open, completely at ease in the middle of the world. Dozens of them down the strip. The whole secret, ordinary human city seen by someone who had clearly loved every overlooked face in it. Casey had been invisible for 2 years. She had learned the textures of that invisibility, the way it settled on you in layers, the way it sometimes felt like armor and sometimes felt like a sentence. And here on a strip of film developed in the back of a shop between a vape store and a shuttered bakery was proof that invisibility could be turned around, that you could take the position of the unseen and make it the most powerful position in the room. You saw everything when nobody was watching you see. She was a housekeeper, Casey said. Her voice came out different than she expected. "I think there are journals." She looked up. "She wrote that people look right through a woman with a mop." Clem was quiet for a moment. "Of course she was," he said softly. "Who else gets to stand in the corner of the whole world and just watch?" He straightened. "How much of this is there, you said tins?" Casey told him, all of it. The tins stacked in rows with pencil labels, the envelopes, the folders of contact sheets, the books tied with kitchen string. She told him about the footlocker in the trunk of her car. Clem looked at the light box. He looked at the contact sheet on the counter. He looked at Casey with an expression she could not entirely read because it was composed of several things at once, and one of them was something she was not accustomed to seeing directed at her. "How much of it have you developed?" he asked. "One roll," she said. "Just now with you." He was quiet. Then he said, "I've been in this shop 40 years. I stopped shooting myself a long time ago. Made more sense to run the business. My wife thought that was the wrong call." A pause. She was almost always right about things like that. He looked at the negatives on the light box. "I want to know what else is in there." Casey looked at him for a moment. "So do I," she said. He offered her the back room that evening with the directness of someone who has decided something and does not want it turned into more of a conversation than it needs to be. A cot, a hot plate, a bathroom with a shower, a deadbolt on the back door, and a window with a fire escape, he said, so she would never feel trapped. And the way he said it made clear that he understood something about what it meant to a person to always know where the exits were. The footlocker and everything in it could stay where it was dry, he said. It was the most interesting thing to come through his door in a decade, and he wasn't about to let it sit in a Civic. Casey stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at the cot and the workbench and the soft light and the stacked boxes of Ruth Calloway's whole life's work, and felt something shift in her chest again, the same door as before, but a little further this time. "Why?" she said. She had to ask. The last time someone had offered her a warm room, it had ended with a garbage bag on a car seat, and she had learned from that the way you learn from burns, not by understanding the physics of heat, but by moving faster near fire. Clem thought about it. Not the way people think when they're searching for the answer that sounds best. The way people think when they actually want to find the right one. "Because somebody should have done it for her," he said, and tipped his head toward the boxes, toward the woman in the journals, toward all those tins of film and all those faces kept from getting away. And nobody did. Not until it was too late to matter to her. He picked up his screwdriver and the half-repaired camera from his bench and turned back to it, which was his way of signaling that the conversation was over and she should stop standing in the doorway. Before he went upstairs for the night, he made good on the other thing. He pulled back the black curtain and stood her at the sink in the red glow of the safe light and showed her how it was done. How to crack a film tin in the pitch dark by feel, how to thread the roll onto the reel without touching the emulsion side, how long to pour the developer, and how to knock the tank against the edge of the sink to release the bubbles. The stop bath smelled like vinegar, and the fixer smelled like low tide, and he let her do the final steps herself, her hands not entirely steady. When she pulled the wet strip out into the light and her breath caught at the faces swimming up out of the silver, Clem only nodded once, the way you nod when something goes exactly the way you thought it would. Some people you can teach this to, he said. Most you can't. It's not the hands. It's whether you can stand to wait in the dark and trust that there's something in there. He hung the strip on the drying line above the sink. You can wait in the dark, he said. I could tell that much about you already. That night, Casey slept indoors for the first time in 8 months, and she did not sleep because she stayed up reading. She sat at Clem's workbench under the gooseneck lamp and untied the kitchen string from the bundle of cloth-covered books, and opened the first one and found a date from decades past, and below it, in the same small, careful hand, she was already learning to recognize a single line. People look right through a woman with a mop. So I learned to look back. Casey read it 3 times. Then she turned the page. The journals were written in a hand so small and so consistent that it took Casey several nights to stop seeing the writing and start reading the words. Ruth Calloway had written the way she apparently did everything else, with economy, with precision, with the absolute minimum of waste. There were no crossed out lines. There were no margins filled with second thoughts. What went down on the page was what had been decided before the pen touched the paper, and that was the version that stayed. Ruth had grown up in a children's home in rural Ohio, which she mentioned once in the first journal, and never returned to, as if the fact of it had been filed and required no further attention. She had gone into domestic service at 15 because in the mid-1950s, that was what girls from places like hers did when they aged out of the system with no family to absorb them and no money to do anything else. She had cleaned houses and raised other people's children and cooked other people's meals and polished other people's silver for 4 decades, moving from family to family as families grew and shrank and relocated and eventually let her go. She had never married. She had never owned a home. She had lived in attic rooms and basement apartments belonging to the people she worked for. And when the work ended, she had packed her things and found more work somewhere else. And in the margins of a life that belonged almost entirely to other people, she had done this. She had walked the city on her half days and her late evenings, and she had taken the camera, and she had stolen frame by frame the only thing that was ever going to be entirely hers. I never owned one thing worth stealing, she had written near the end of the second journal. So I stole light instead, a frame at a time. Nobody ever caught me because nobody ever looked. Casey read that and sat with it for a long time. She developed a role every night, sometimes 2, when the work went well and the chemistry was cooperating, and she lost track of time in the red-lit quiet of the darkroom. She got fast. She got better. Clem taught her when she asked and stayed out of the way when she didn't, which was the right proportion of teaching. He had a gift for identifying which problems a person needed help with and which problems they needed to solve on their own. And he deployed that gift without ever mentioning that he was doing so. The faces that came up out of the developer trays were a different city than the one Casey moved through every day. It was the same streets, the same gray Portland light, the same stoops and bus shelters and lunch counters. But seen through Ruth Calloway's eye, it was a city populated entirely by people who had never expected to be looked at and had therefore not arranged their faces for it. A man in a phone booth with his forehead pressed against the glass and his eyes closed, enduring something. 2 elderly women on a bench outside a grocery store, laughing at something one of them had said so completely, in the grip of that laughter that they had forgotten their bodies and leaned toward each other at the same angle, like twin trees shaped by the same wind. A child asleep in a shopping cart, feet dangling, surrounded by groceries, dreaming whatever it is that children dream in the middle of supermarkets. Ruth had been invisible among all of them. She had stood on sidewalks and sat on park benches and leaned against walls, and none of the people she was photographing had the slightest idea she was there. And that not knowing was the thing that made the pictures what they were. There was no performance in any of them, no face put on for the camera. Just people being entirely themselves in the moments between the moments they managed for public consumption. Casey thought about her own photographs. The steam from the storm drain, the old man at the bus stop. She had been doing the same thing with a cracked phone and had never had the words for what she was doing or why it felt necessary. Here were the words. Here was someone who had been doing it for 50 years and had written the reason down. On the fourth night, she found an entry that stopped her. Took my rolls to the drugstore again today and turned around at the door. Ruth had written. Same as always. Once they're printed, they belong to whoever looks. While they're still mine, nobody can tell me they're not good enough. Nobody can hand them back. Casey read that 3 times and then wrote it on the back of her hand with a ballpoint pen because she did not trust herself to remember it accurately, and she needed it to be somewhere she could not misplace. She thought about the folder of photographs on her cracked phone that she had never shown to another living person. She thought about the reason she had never shown them, which she had always told herself was because there was no one to show. But reading Ruth's entry in the small hours of the morning under the gooseneck lamp, she understood that wasn't entirely it. The real reason was the same one Ruth had been circling for 50 years. While they were still hers, no one could tell her they weren't enough. Clem came down for water one night around 2 in the morning and found Casey surrounded by open boxes with 3 contact sheets spread across the workbench and the 4th journal open in her lap. He looked at the scene for a moment without saying anything, the way you look at something you half expected to find. He poured his water. He picked up one of the contact sheets and held it to the lamp and studied it for a while. "You know what you're sitting on," he said finally. It was not quite a question, but he left space as if it were. "Pictures," Casey said. "A whole life of them." Clem set the sheet down carefully, both hands flat on the bench. "I had a customer once," he said. Brought in a single print he'd found in his uncle's attic. Nobody had heard of the photographer. I looked at it for about 30 seconds and I knew. He looked at the boxes around them. "Sold at auction for more than this shop is worth." He paused. "What's in these boxes is not one print." Casey looked at the contact sheets. She looked at the rows of film tins still waiting to be opened. "I want to know who she was," she said, "before anyone else decides." She made the decision about the forum post herself on a Thursday morning while Clem was with a customer up front. She scanned 3 of the strongest prints on the old flatbed scanner Clem kept for archival work, cleaned up the files on his desktop, and posted them to a photography forum she'd found while searching Ruth's camera model. She wrote 3 sentences. She said she'd come across the work in an estate situation. She said she was trying to identify the photographer. She said she'd appreciate any help. She did not use Ruth's name because she did not yet have Ruth's full name. She did not mention where she was. She posted the images and closed the browser and went back to the darkroom and cracked open another film tin. When she came out an hour later, Clem was at the counter and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. "The post," he said. She met his eyes. "I know. You opened a door. I know that too." She set the finished strip on the light box. "I needed to know what was on the other side before whoever's on the other side figures out where the door is." Clem was quiet for a moment. Then he went back to what he was working on. "All right," he said. The post did not stay quiet. By the next morning, it had accumulated 40 responses. By the following afternoon, it had jumped from the photography forum to larger platforms, the kind where tens of thousands of people argued about things they cared about deeply and had strong opinions they would share with anyone who held still long enough. People Casey had never heard of were calling the work extraordinary. Someone used the phrase "photograph of the century," and someone else told them to calm down, and then 17 people told that person that they were wrong. Dr. Sylvie Crane sent a direct message on the 3rd day. She was brief and precise and did not oversell herself. She said she was a curator at a Pacific Northwest museum, that she had been looking at photographs professionally for 22 years, and that what she had seen in those three images was unlike anything she had encountered in the context of undiscovered work. She asked if she could come see the rest. Casey wrote back and said yes and gave the address of the shop. Dr. Crane arrived on a Saturday in a gray wool coat with a leather bag over one shoulder, driving a practical car she clearly owned a long time and intended to keep owning. She was somewhere around 50, with the kind of face that has spent decades looking carefully at things and has developed a resting expression of calibrated attention. She shook Casey's hand with both of hers and thanked her for reaching out, and then asked if she could see the work. She spent 4 hours with the boxes. She wore white cotton gloves, and she moved through the contact sheets and the loose prints with a slowness that was not hesitation, but its opposite. The deliberate pace of someone who has learned not to rush past things they cannot unsee. She didn't speak much. Occasionally, she would hold a print to the light and be still for a long moment, and then set it down and move on. Once she sat with a single contact sheet for nearly 20 minutes without looking up. When she was done, she sat at the workbench and took off her gloves and folded them together and looked at Casey and Clem and told them the truth in the direct, careful way of someone who has decided that clarity is more respectful than comfort. "I want to be honest with you about what this is," she said, "because someone less honest is going to come through that door, and I'd prefer you to have heard it from me first." She set her gloved hands on the bench. "This is a major body of work, museum level, significant. Once it's properly printed, cataloged, and attributed in an archive like this, managed correctly over years, could be worth several $1,000,000, possibly more. I'm not exaggerating to make you feel good about something you're going to give away cheaply." Casey heard the words, several $1,000,000, arrive in the room and felt them land somewhere outside her normal frame of reference, the way very large numbers do when you have spent the past year counting out coffee money. "They're just pictures of regular people," she said. "People waiting for buses, kids in the street." Dr. Crane looked at her steadily. "That's exactly why," she said. "Money chases what it cannot manufacture for itself. You can buy a beautiful photograph of almost anything on any corner in any city in the world. What you cannot buy is 50 years of one invisible woman deciding that the ignored and the discarded were the only subjects worth pointing a lens at." She touched the edge of a print with one bare finger. "That's not a technique. That's a soul. And people will pay extraordinary amounts of money for evidence that one of those still existed." Then she said the other part. The print rights, the copyright, the right to reproduce the work and license it and profit from it, none of that belonged to Casey. It belonged to the artist, and after the artist's death, it belonged to whoever had inherited from her. Her estate, her family if she had any. "Nobody came for the unit," Casey said. "That's the whole reason I got it." "Then we need to establish that clearly and legally," Dr. Crane said. "Because everything else, every decision that gets made about this work from here forward depends on that question." She left her card on the workbench. "Find out if there's anyone. If there isn't, the legal situation becomes complicated in a different direction. But find out first." She was barely out of the parking lot before the first phone call came. Miles Archer arrived 4 days later on a Thursday afternoon. Casey was in the dark room when the bell above the front door rang, and she came out still drying her hands on a cloth to find a man in a charcoal overcoat standing at the counter, looking at a contact sheet he had taken the liberty of picking up from the bench. He was somewhere around 50 silver at the temples, with the kind of face that had been arranging itself to put people at ease for so many years that it had forgotten how to do anything else. He was not performing warmth. He simply had it, which was the more dangerous version. He set the contact sheet down when he saw Casey and smiled in a way that involved his eyes. "Miles Archer," he said. He did not say who he worked for or where he had come from, because men like him have learned that those questions reveal themselves in time, and it is better to let the other person's curiosity do the work. "I came as soon as I saw the post." He had handled 4 estates like this one, he explained. He named 2 of them. Casey didn't know the names, but from the way Clem's expression changed slightly, she understood they were names worth knowing. He had spent his career finding artists the world had set down and not bothered to pick back up and giving them back what they were owed. He walked through the boxes with the same careful attention Dr. Crane had brought, but with something additional underneath it, an acquisitive quality. Like a man taking inventory of something he has already decided to acquire. He picked up the print of The Man in the Rain, the very first one Casey had found, and looked at it for a long time. The love was real. That was the thing she noticed. He wasn't performing appreciation. Whatever response he was having to the photograph, it was genuine. And that was what made him difficult. "Here is what I want to say plainly," he said, setting the print down, "because I think you deserve plain speaking, and I suspect you don't get enough of it." He looked at Casey directly. "Right now, you are a 20-year-old woman with no permanent address sitting on a legal situation that is going to get complicated very fast. The storage company has already been in touch with their lawyers. The moment real money gets attached to this, people you have never met are going to come looking for a piece of it. You cannot fight them from a cot." He let that sit. "I'll buy the negatives," he said. "All of them tonight as physical property, which is the one thing you unambiguously own. I'll handle the lawyers, the copyright questions, the printing, the galleries, the entire thing. You walk away clean." Casey heard herself ask the question before she had consciously decided to ask it. What happens to her name? Archer's smile didn't waver, but something behind it made a small private adjustment, the kind of recalculation you make when a variable you thought you had accounted for turns out to be larger than you estimated. "She gets everything she's owed," he said. "A name, a story, the full attribution. People love the story. The forgotten housekeeper, the secret genius. It tells itself." Casey noticed that he had not answered the question she had asked. She filed that away. He named the number then and let it live in the air of the shop. $250,000 cash by Monday. The cooler in the back hummed. The bell above the door was still. Casey's ears had a faint ringing in them, the physiological response to a number that size entering a room she was standing in. $250,000. She tried to hold the shape of it in her mind, and it kept slipping too large for the vessel she had available. It was never having to count coins in a gas station parking lot again. It was a security deposit and first month's rent, and a bed in a room with a door that locked from the inside. It was never again waking up at 5:45 in a sleeping bag in the back of a car because someone else's laundromat schedule determined the terms of her morning. It was everything she had taught herself at 9 years old in the back seat of a caseworker's car with a garbage bag on the seat beside her to stop wanting. "Think about it over the weekend," Archer said. He left his card on top of Dr. Crane's card, and the warmth of him stayed in the room after he'd gone. The way heat stays in a space after the source of it has moved on. Casey stood at the workbench for a long time after Clem had gone upstairs. She looked at the boxes, she looked at the contact sheets, she looked at the first print, The Man in the Rain, which she had propped against the wall where she could see it from the cot when she lay down at night. "He didn't know I was there. They never do." She did not sleep well. She had been arranging and rearranging the printed photographs across the floor of the back room for several nights, a habit she'd developed without quite intending, to spreading them out by date, and then pulling them back in and spreading them out again in some different configuration, as if the pictures were a sentence she was trying to parse. She had printed everything she'd developed so far. There were rows of them across the floor of Clem's back room, the oldest images at the top of the room and the newer ones working their way toward the door. On the 5th night of this, she found the face. She almost didn't. It was in the background of a frame that was ostensibly about something else entirely, a street fair, vendors and crowds, and a man selling produce from a cart. And the face was off to the left, half obscured by another figure so small in the frame that you would need the loupe to see it clearly and a reason to look. A child of about 5 standing behind a chain-link fence at the edge of the fairground, watching the activity on the other side. The photograph had been taken from a distance from across the street at minimum. The child was entirely unaware. The expression on that small face was one of absolute uncomplicated longing. Casey moved the loop over it and felt something catch in her throat. She went through the boxes again that night and pulled every print she'd made and spread them all across the floor by date and went back through them on her hands and knees with the gooseneck lamp low looking for the face. It was there. Again and again across the decades, always at the edge of the frame, always at a distance, always caught from a position that made clear the photographer had been far enough away to be undetectable. The girl behind the chain-link fence at the fair, 5 years old, maybe 6. A school sidewalk where children were lined up to have their portraits taken by a photographer who wasn't Ruth. And in the middle of the line, a child who could only be the same child a few years older. Not looking at anything in particular, unaware of everything, including the woman behind the parked car across the street who had her own camera raised. A teenager at a bus stop framed between two strangers, not looking at the lens. A young woman in a wedding dress on the steps of a county courthouse, photographed from so far across the square that she occupied maybe a quarter-inch of the frame. You would miss her entirely if you weren't the person who had spent the last 3 nights learning to find that face. A woman in her 30s pushing a stroller along a sidewalk that had a particular tree on the corner, a madrone with peeling copper bark, and Casey stared at that tree for a long moment because it seemed like the kind of tree you'd remember if you'd seen it before. The same woman years later, hair shorter and beginning to gray, holding a child by the hand outside a school. A woman in her 50s on the porch of a house that was not Ruth's house, and in a town that looked different from any of the other backgrounds Casey had been cataloging somewhere, with a different quality of light and a different style of architecture. Pacific Northwest coastal, she thought the particular gray-white sky of somewhere near the water. And then, in what turned out to be one of the last rolls of film before the tins became sparse and the dates began clustering in the final decade of Ruth's life, a woman in her 60s on the porch of a pale yellow house with a porch swing and a length of wooden ramp along one side, the raw wood of it not yet weathered, recently built. Casey sat back on her heels. She sat there for a long time. The dates were too consistent. The intervals were too deliberate. When Ruth moved, as she had moved many times over 40 years of domestic work, the face in the background of her photographs moved first. The face appeared in new cities before Ruth had settled into those cities, before she had found work there. There were even entries in the journals that Casey had read and filed away as the observations of a solitary woman musing about the lives of strangers she passed in her neighborhood, which she now understood were something entirely different. She's in the 3rd grade now. She's getting married Saturday. I read it in the paper. She named the baby after her husband's mother, not after anyone of mine. Not a stranger. Never a stranger. Not once across the entire span of the archive. Casey looked at the rows of prints spread across the floor of the back room and felt the whole shape of the thing she was holding turn over slowly in her chest and become something different than what she had thought it was. Because Ruth Calloway had not been building an archive of a city. Ruth Calloway had not been documenting the invisible population of whatever place she happened to be living. Ruth Calloway had been following one person for more than half a century from a distance that never closed with a love she had never once allowed herself to deliver. Casey sat in the middle of the photographs and said very quietly to the empty room, "Oh, who is she to you?" She did not sleep that night at all. In the morning, she found the dog license. She had pulled the shoebox of cards from the salvage pile 2 days earlier with the intention of looking through it more carefully, and she had kept not getting to it. And on the morning after she found the face across 5 decades of film, she finally opened it again and went through it properly. Renewal notices, a church bulletin, a grocery circular. And near the bottom, a City of Portland dog license renewal made out to Ruth Calloway at an address on the north side. For one dog, male, shepherd mix, neutered, named Duke. Casey looked at the license for a long moment. Then she looked at the dates on the most recent film tins. Ruth had died sometime in the past year or so. She had inferred that from the gap in the journal entries, which simply stopped the way things stop when the person maintaining them is no longer able to. A dog surrendered when its owner died with no family to take it. She picked up her phone and called the number for the city shelter on the north side. The woman who answered had the careful, neutral voice of someone who has learned to deliver information without editorializing because the information is often hard. Yes, they had a record of a dog surrendered from that address. Owner deceased, no next of kin listed. A senior shepherd mix, the woman confirmed. Male. She paused. Long stay senior, she said in that same careful voice, had limited time. Duke was on a list. Casey was already on her feet. She found Clem in the front of the shop doing inventory, counting something in a glass case with his reading glasses down on his nose. I need to borrow the wagon, she said. He looked at her over the glasses. She showed him the dog license. He put down his clipboard and reached under the counter for his keys without another word. The shelter was on the north side, a 40-minute drive in Clem's wood-paneled station wagon that he drove with the careful attention of a man who has owned something long enough to know exactly which of its quirks require accommodation. Casey sat in the passenger seat with the dog license in her hand and looked out the window at Portland going by and thought about Ruth Calloway taking jobs in the towns where her daughter lived, cleaning houses 3 streets from a school, watching a child she had born and surrendered ride a bicycle in someone else's backyard, watching, always from the other side of the street. The shelter was low and institutional and smelled the way shelters smell, antiseptic, over something underneath that the antiseptic has not managed to fully reach. A woman at the desk pulled up the record and led them to the back. Duke was in a run near the end of the row. He was large and graying and moved with the careful deliberateness of an old dog whose joints had decided to register their objections formally. His right ear stood up, and his left ear didn't quite make it, folding over at the tip in a way that seemed like a permanent feature. He had the long face and the deep-set eyes of a dog who had once been very alert and was conserving that alertness now for things that actually warranted it. When the shelter worker opened the run, Duke came out and stopped. He looked at the woman from the shelter. He looked at Clem. He looked at Casey. He did not wag his tail. He did not approach. He stood and looked at them with the measured, unsentimental gaze of an animal that had learned to complete its evaluation before committing to anything, because enough people had walked away that he had stopped assuming the good version was what was actually on offer. Casey crouched down. She did not reach for him. She got low and stayed there and let him do whatever he needed to do with however much time he needed to do it. Duke lifted his nose and worked the air in her direction. He took 2 steps toward her. He stopped again. Then, as if he had completed a calculation and arrived at a result he hadn't expected but was willing to accept, he leaned. He simply transferred his weight toward her, his whole tired, gray-muzzled 100-pound body, and rested it against her shoulder and let out a breath that seemed to have been waiting a long time to be let out. Casey put her arms around him. "Yeah," she said into his fur. "I know. They got him out that afternoon. It cost the last of Casey's money and some of Clem's, and nobody made a point of the accounting." On the drive back, Duke put his chin on Casey's knee and closed his eyes, and she sat with her hand on his side and felt him breathe. Clem bought a bag of senior dog food on the way back without consulting her about it, which she understood to mean the conversation about Duke's living arrangements was considered settled. That evening, Duke ate with the focus of an animal that has been reminded it is allowed to eat. He circled the back room 3 times and then lowered himself down against the footlocker with a sound of profound relief, his nose pointed at the green metal, and slept. It was past midnight when Duke woke her. Not with barking. He simply stood up from his place against the footlocker and pressed his nose into the lower left corner of the base, the same corner with the focused patience of an animal who has decided something is there and is prepared to wait out the human's understanding of it. Casey turned on the gooseneck lamp and watched him for a moment. Then she got up. She had run her hands along the outside of that locker a dozen times. The base panel looked no different from any other surface. But Duke kept his nose exactly where it was, one paw flat against the seam, and did not look up. Casey crouched. She pressed the corner he was indicating. The panel shifted. It was not a large space beneath. 2 inches, maybe 3, a deliberate shallow cavity built into the base of the locker at some point lined with a piece of old felt that had kept the moisture out. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth tied with kitchen string that matched the string from the journals. The same careful double knot, the same deliberate hand, was a flat parcel no larger than a hardcover book. Duke stepped back and sat down and watched her with his mismatched ears, his work apparently concluded. Casey untied the string with hands that were not entirely steady. Inside the oilcloth were prints, not negatives, not contact sheets. Prince Ruth had made herself full-sized, careful, chosen from among all the thousands of frames she had taken across more than half a century. Every one of them was the woman from the margins, the child, the girl, the young woman, the woman in middle age, the woman growing old, arranged in order from first to last, the complete private record of a life documented by someone who had never once been acknowledged in return. And on top of the prints, folded in quarters, the paper soft from being handled many times, and then put away and handled again, was a letter. Casey set the prints aside carefully, the way she had learned to handle things that had been kept for a very long time. She read the letter under the lamp while Duke settled against her ankle. It did not take long. Ruth Calloway had written it in the same economical hand as everything else she had ever set down, without decoration, without circling. She said she had a daughter once. 4 days in 1956 in a hospital in Columbus, Ohio. She said she had signed the papers because a nurse held her hand and a priest told her it was love to let the baby go to people who could give her things. And she had been a girl with nothing, and she had believed them. She said she had found out where the child went and had stayed close enough to watch without ever coming close enough to matter, because she had given up the right to matter, and she knew it and had never stopped knowing it. She said she was writing this down because she could not die being the only person who had ever known that the daughter was loved. At the bottom of the letter, in handwriting slightly different from the rest, the unsteady script of her final years laid over the practiced small hand she had used for 50 years. Her name is Vivian Marsh. The last I let myself look, she was in Astoria, Oregon. Please, if she is still there, and if you are kind, tell her only this, that a woman watched her whole life and thought she was the most beautiful thing the world ever made and was never sorry she had her. Only sorry she wasn't braver. Casey set the letter down in her lap. Duke was already asleep again, his weight against her ankle, his breathing slow and even. She sat in the lamp's small circle with the oilcloth parcel and the prints and the letter spread around her, and did not move for a very long time. Outside, the refrigerator hummed in the front of the shop, and the city did what the city does in the deep hours, which is to keep going in a lower register. It sounds farther away and less urgent, but continuous proof that the world was still there and still turning, whether or not anyone in this back room was ready for it. Casey lay on the cot and listened to Duke breathe and thought that she and the old dog and the dead woman were all the same kind of creature, left behind, waiting in a back room, still hoping in a cautious and deniable way that someone was coming. She was still thinking this when she heard Clem's footstep on the stairs, and then the sound of the back door, and she sat up and looked at his face when he came in. The face told her before he said anything. "There's been a development," he said. Miles Archer had called. He had seen the letter from Key Point's attorneys, he said. He had known about the letter before Casey had received it, which meant he had contacts inside the company or inside the legal process, or both, and he had mentioned this not to threaten, but to demonstrate the extent of his reach. The storage company's position was that the giveaway had conveyed ordinary household contents for personal use and had not contemplated items of extraordinary commercial value, and therefore the company reserved its rights to claim the archive. Archer's lawyers could make that claim disappear, he said, and he had said it in the tone of someone explaining that they can change the weather. All it required was Casey's signature. He had called to say that his offer was still open and that he hoped she understood by now that the window was not permanent. Casey sat on the cot and looked at Duke asleep and did not say anything for a long time. In the morning, the car was gone. She had walked to the laundromat lot at 7:15 because she had left a charging cable in the console, and it was the only charging cable she owned. The lot was empty. Not empty of her car specifically, but empty of everything chained off at the entrance with a padlock and a sign from a property management company, and a bright orange sticker on the fence post with a tow company's phone number, and at the bottom in smaller print, the fee schedule. The amount printed there bore no reasonable relationship to any amount of money Casey had ever had at one time. She stood at the fence and looked at the empty asphalt. A coffee cup someone had dropped near the entrance turned slowly in the wind. The car was nothing. She had known it was nothing for a long time. It was 1,500 pounds of metal that needed three things fixed that she couldn't afford to fix, and ran on hope and stubbornness and an oil additive she bought in bulk because she couldn't afford the alternative. But the car was hers. It was the one thing in the world that was entirely hers, that had been hers with no conditions attached, that no placement agency or caseworker or property owner could rescind with a phone call and a clipboard, in a practiced expression of gentle regret. More than that, the car was the exit. As long as the car existed, she could leave. She could always pack everything she had in 20 minutes and go somewhere else and start over, because starting over was a thing she had been doing her whole life, and she knew how. But you could only start over if you could get somewhere else. Without the car, she was staying. And staying had never in her experience been something she was allowed to do without someone eventually changing their mind about it. She stood at the fence for a long time. Then she reached into her pocket and took out Miles Archer's card and looked at it. Then she put it back and walked to the shop. Clem was at the bench when she came in through the back. He looked at her face and set down what he was holding. She sat down. She didn't mean to cry, and she did anyway, which she hated, not because she believed crying was weakness, but because it revealed the exact location of the wound, and she had spent years keeping the wound's location to herself. She said the things that had been accumulating for 3 weeks and maybe for 12 years. Everything she had told herself about people like her and what they were allowed to want, and what always happened when they reached for things that belonged to other categories of person. She said them in a rough and ugly voice, and she didn't try to make them more reasonable or more fair than they were, because they weren't reasonable and they weren't fair, and that was precisely the problem with them. She told Clem she should sign the papers, that Archer was right, that you couldn't fight anyone from a cot, that the car was gone and she had $9 and a dog she couldn't feed, and a collection of photographs she had no legal right to, and this was the part where it fell apart. This was the part it always reached, and she was tired of being surprised by it. She said that she wanted him to prove her wrong. She could hear herself wanting it, and she hated that too. Clem sat across the workbench from her and did not flinch and did not fill the silence with the kind of reassurances that are really just requests for a person to stop being upset so you don't have to sit with them in it. He let her finish. He waited until she was just breathing. Then he said, "My wife and I couldn't have children." Casey looked at him. "You didn't know that," he said. "Of course you didn't. I never told you." He looked at the boxes of film tins at the prints spread across the floor. 40 years I had this shop and no one to leave it to." He was quiet for a moment. Then a girl walks in off the street with a dead woman's camera and a better eye than most of the photographers I've ever met, and asks me why I care. He shook his head slowly. "People like us," he said. "You keep saying that. You want to know the real difference between us and Miles Archer." He met her eyes. "He leaves when the work is done. That's his whole model. He comes in, he acquires the thing, he profits from the thing, and then he goes find the next thing. We're the ones who don't leave." He picked up the print of the man in the rain, the first one, and held it for a moment. "That's not a weakness. That's the whole point of us. That's what makes us worth anything." Casey sat with that. "I'm not going to send you back," Clem said. "Nobody is." He set the print down. "You won the unit, you're keeping the unit, and we're going to figure the rest of it out." He stood and turned toward the hot plate. "Now let me make some coffee, and let's think." She sat. Duke got up from the corner and crossed the room and pressed his full gray-muzzled weight against her leg without ceremony, the way he had decided early that this was simply what he did now, and that she was the reason he did it. Casey put her hand in his fur. Clem put 2 mugs on the bench and sat back down, and they spread out what they had in front of them. The attorney's letter, Dr. Crane's card, Archer's card. The barest facts of the situation, which were these: Casey owned the physical negatives and nothing else. The storage company wanted them back. Archer wanted them forward on his terms. And the one fact that could untangle the whole thing, the single thread that pulled would make the knot come loose, was a question none of them had the answer to yet. Had Ruth Calloway left anyone behind? If there was an heir, the copyright belonged to that person. Not to Archer, not to the storage company, not to anyone willing to fight the hardest or spend the most. If there was an heir, everything else was noise. Casey looked at the rows of photographs still spread across the floor, at the face that appeared again and again across decades of film, always at the edge, always at a distance, always unaware. She was real. She existed. She had a life that Ruth had documented across more than 50 years in more than one state. She had grown up and married and had children and aged and built a ramp on her porch for reasons that probably related to her own aging body or the body of someone she loved. She was someone. The question was whether Casey could find her before Archer made the question irrelevant. She looked at the photograph of the woman on the pale yellow porch, the low angle of the light, the bare wood of the new ramp, the particular sky above the roofline, Pacific Northwest coastal. The quality of the light was unmistakable once you had spent enough time under it. Somewhere near water, somewhere the sky had that flat, pewter quality in late afternoon. Casey looked at the photograph until her eyes felt dry. Then she picked up one of the cloth-covered journals from the stack, opened it, started going back through it with different eyes, reading each entry not for what it said about Ruth's interior life, but for what it inadvertently revealed about geography, about where she had been and when. 3 entries stood out. 3 entries with small specific details: a name, a publication, a very particular tree. Casey sat at the bench until it was past midnight building a map. Duke slept. The refrigerator hummed in the front of the shop. The letter from Ruth's oilcloth parcel lay on the bench in front of her unfolded. Vivian Marsh, Astoria, Oregon. Casey looked at the name until it stopped being letters and started being a person. She did not tell Clem what she had found until the morning. Not because she was keeping it from him, but because the letter felt like something that needed to be held alone for a few hours before it became a thing that existed in the world between people. Some information is like that. You need to be the only one who knows it for a little while, just long enough to understand what it means to you before you have to explain it to someone else. She lay on the cot with the oilcloth parcel beside her and Duke breathing at her feet, and looked at the ceiling and thought about Ruth Calloway writing those words in the unsteady hand of an old woman who had run out of time to keep the secret any longer, who had assembled the prints and sealed them away beneath the locker's false bottom, and then presumably had gone on with the business of dying, which by that point was probably the main business she had left. Tell her only this, that a woman watched her whole life and thought she was the most beautiful thing the world ever made. Casey had been watched her whole life too, by caseworkers with clipboards, by families who were deciding, by people in the system who looked at her the way you look at a file rather than a person assessing and categorizing and moving on. She knew what it felt like to be watched by people who had not yet decided whether you were worth keeping. She had no idea what it would feel like to be told that someone had watched you for 50 years and every single frame of it had been an act of love. In the morning, she got up before Clem came downstairs and made coffee on the hot plate and stood at the workbench with the letter and looked at the name written at the bottom of it until the name stopped being letters and started being a person. Vivian Marsh, Astoria, Oregon. Astoria was a 2-hour drive, a city on the mouth of the Columbia where it met the Pacific, the kind of place people stayed when they found it and didn't leave. She had looked it up on her phone in the small hours reading about it, without quite knowing why, and the image that had stayed with her was the bridge across the river, long and low and gray, the kind of bridge a person could stand on and watch the water and feel the size of things. When Clem came down, she was on her second cup and the letter was on the bench between the 2 mugs. He read it without picking it up, standing over it with his reading glasses on and both hands wrapped around his coffee. He read it twice. Then he straightened up and took his glasses off. Astoria, he said. 2 hours. He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man who has already done the relevant calculation and found the answer straightforward. I'll get the keys, he said. She stopped him. I need to borrow the wagon, she said. Not you, me. He looked at her. I'm the one who found it, she said. I need to be the one who takes it to her. She held his eyes. You understand that. He did. She could see it in the way the argument he might have made arranged itself and then stood down. He understood exactly what she was saying, and he respected it, which was the thing she had come to understand about Clem Harwick in the 3 weeks she had known him. He respected the line between helping and taking over, and he stayed on the correct side of it without being asked twice. He put the keys on the bench. Blinker on the left side sticks, he said. You have to tap it twice. She loaded the wagon carefully. The footlocker went in the back, wedged between Clem's equipment cases and an old furniture blanket she folded around the corners to keep the metal from shifting. The oilcloth parcel she carried on her lap in the front seat. The last journal with the letter tucked back into it where she'd found it, she put in her bag. Duke took up the entire back seat with the relaxed authority of a dog who considers himself a primary passenger rather than cargo. It was early, the city still gray and cool. The streets with that particular emptiness that belongs to the hour before most people have committed to the day. Casey drove west and then north, picking up the highway that followed the river toward the coast. The water was high and dark on her left, running fast with the season in it. She had rehearsed what she would say. She had started in her head somewhere around 3 in the morning and had not stopped since, and every version of it was wrong. There was no version that was not on its face insane. Hello, you don't know me. A woman who died recently spent 50 years following you around and photographing you from a distance out of a love so enormous and so private that she was never once able to speak it out loud. I won her storage unit in a raffle. There was no sane approach to this door. So at some point in the second hour of the drive, with the sky going brighter and the river widening toward the estuary and the smell of salt beginning to come in through the vents, she stopped trying to find the sane approach and decided to just knock and tell the truth and see what happened. The truth was the only thing she actually had to offer. The rest of it, the archive and the legal situation and Miles Archer and all the rest, was peripheral. The thing she was bringing to this door was the truth that a woman had loved this person for her entire adult life and had not been brave enough to say so and had found one last way to try. Casey could be brave enough for both of them. She thought about Ruth carrying that letter to the edge of sending it. The stamp already fixed. The address already written in her careful hand. Everything prepared. Everything decided. And then the final step that would not come. The letter folded back and tucked away and never mentioned again. Ruth had carried the weight of almost doing it for the rest of her life. And now Casey was carrying it the rest of the way to the door it had always been meant for. The address in Ruth's letter led to a residential street 3 blocks from the water, the kind of street where the houses were old and well kept, and the yards had the slightly salt-roughened look of gardens that have been doing their best against the coastal weather for a long time. The pale yellow house was the 4th from the corner. She recognized it before she saw the number because of the porch swing and the ramp. The raw wood of the ramp, now slightly less raw than it had been in Ruth's last photograph, beginning its slow progress toward the silver gray that the weather would eventually make of it. Casey parked across the street. She sat in the wagon for 10 minutes. Duke rested his chin on the back of her seat and breathed quietly near her ear. I know, she said. Give me a second. She thought about Ruth standing on the far side of one street after another for 50 years, raising the camera, waiting in the dark behind the lens, and never once walking across. She thought about the letter with its stamp and its careful address, and all the distance it had almost traveled and never did. She thought about how much courage it takes to cross a street when you have told yourself for half a century that you don't have the right. She thought about a 9-year-old girl in the back of a caseworker's car with a garbage bag and the specific quality of silence that comes after a door has been closed on you. Not cruelly, just firmly, by people who have decided to close it. She thought about how she had spent 12 years since that car ride, learning not to knock on doors because doors could always be closed again, and the closing was always worse when you had let yourself hope. She picked up the oilcloth parcel from the seat beside her. She got out of the car. The morning air off the river was cold and clean and smelled like everything that was large and indifferent and had been there long before the street and would be there long after, which was either comforting or frightening depending on the moment. And this morning it was comforting, and she held on to that as she crossed the street and went up the front walk and knocked on the door before she could talk herself into any of the alternatives. The woman who opened the door was 70 years old and was wearing a cardigan the color of oatmeal and had reading glasses pushed up on her head and a dish towel in her hands, and her face was the face from the photographs. Not the face of the 5-year-old behind the fence or the teenager at the bus stop or the young woman on the courthouse steps, but the face underneath all those faces, the one that had persisted through all the years of change and remained recognizable as the same person. And Casey would have known it anywhere because she had spent 2 weeks on her knees on a cold floor learning it. Vivian Marsh looked at the young woman on her porch with the particular alertness of someone who is not expecting company and has learned to pay attention to the unscheduled. "Can I help you, honey?" Casey's voice came out smaller than she intended. It did that sometimes when she needed it most. "Are you Vivian Marsh?" A small flicker of wariness. The wariness of a person who has learned that strangers who come to the door knowing your name are usually selling something or serving something. "That's me," Vivian said. "Do I know you?" "No," Casey said. "You don't, but somebody did." She held the oilcloth parcel against her chest with both arms. "I drove from Portland this morning and I practiced what I was going to say the whole way, and it's all gone now." She could hear herself, the words coming out too fast and slightly ragged at the edges, and she made herself slow down. "I need to show you something. It's going to sound strange before it makes sense, and then when it makes sense, it's going to be the most important thing anyone has ever told you." She met the older woman's eyes. "I promise you that. I just need you to let me start." Vivian Marsh looked at her for a long moment. The dish towel went still in her hands. She looked at the parcel pressed against Casey's chest. She looked at Casey's face, which was Casey knew not the face of someone who means harm. It was too scared for that. Nobody who means harm ever looks that frightened. Vivian stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," she said. "I'll put some coffee on." The kitchen had a vinyl tablecloth with a pattern of small blue flowers and a bowl of fruit on the counter that was mostly real with one plastic apple mixed in that Casey suspected had been there long enough that its presence was no longer questioned. The window over the sink looked out at a yard where a bird feeder hung from the branch of a plum tree, and 2 sparrows were working it with the focused determination of small animals that have decided this particular morning belongs to them. They sat across from each other at the table, and Casey set the parcel down between them and started from the beginning because there was nowhere else to start. She told Vivian about the storage lot and the raffle and the 30 men in work boots and the one ticket Lyle Dutton had pushed across the counter out of something that was not quite pity and not quite kindness, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. She told her about Unit 44 and the wall of someone's whole life, packed to the ceiling, and the ruined magazines and the shoebox of greeting cards, where the handwriting got smaller and the messages got shorter until they stopped. She told her about the photograph of the man in the rain. She took it out of the parcel and placed it on the vinyl tablecloth, and Vivian looked at it and then looked back at Casey and did not say anything, which Casey understood meant she should keep going. She told her about Clem Harwick and his shop and the first role developed in the red light and the faces that came up out of the developer and the quality of seeing in every single one of them that she had spent 2 weeks trying to find words for and still hadn't quite managed. She told her about the journals, about Ruth Calloway's small, careful handwriting and her economy of language and the things she had written about being invisible and what you could do with invisibility if you were paying attention. She said her name was Ruth Calloway. She was born in 1937 in Ohio, and she went into domestic service at 15 and spent 40 years cleaning other people's houses and living in the rooms they were willing to spare, and she never married, and she died in the past year at the age of 87, and nobody came to claim her things. And she said she had a daughter once, for 4 days, in 1956, in a hospital in Columbus. She was 19 and she wasn't married, and the nurse held her hand, and the priest said it was love to let the baby go to people who could give her things, and she was a girl with nothing, and she believed them. Vivian Marsh had gone very still across the table. Her hands were flat on the vinyl fingers spread, as if she needed the contact with the surface to stay located. The dish towel was a rope in her lap. "I was adopted," she said. Her voice was entirely even the voice of someone drawing on a long practice of steadiness. "In 1956, my parents never hid it from me. They told me my birth mother was a young woman who couldn't keep me, and that was all anyone knew." A breath. "I stopped wondering a long time ago." You make your peace with the not knowing. You tell yourself the story that lets you function, and you stop pulling at the thread, because pulling at it never changed anything. Casey spread the photographs across the table, then one at a time, in order from oldest to newest, the way Ruth had arranged them in the oilcloth parcel, the way someone had assembled that sequence, who knew exactly the order it needed to be in. The 5-year-old at the fairground fence. Vivian looked at it. She looked at the chain-link fence and the fairground on the other side, and the small figure standing at the edge of all that noise and color watching. The 9-year-old in the school photograph line. Casey watched Vivian's face as she looked at this one and saw the recognition arrive not immediately, but in stages, the way things arrive when they are unexpected and the mind needs a moment to verify. "That's my school," Vivian said slowly. "That's the sidewalk outside Greenway Elementary." She looked up. "How far away was this taken?" "From across the street," Casey said, "behind a parked car." Vivian looked back at the photograph. Casey laid down the next one, and the next. The teenager at the bus stop, the courthouse steps, the wedding dress, the borrowed flowers, the stroller, the child by the hand, the porch with the new ramp that was now the porch they were sitting 30 feet from. Vivian's hand came up and covered her mouth. Casey waited. When you are bringing someone something this large, you do not rush the receiving of it. You lay it down and you step back and you give them the space the size of the thing requires. "All of this time," Vivian said from behind her hand, "all of this time she stopped. She looked at the photograph spread across the blue flower tablecloth. The whole arc of her own life laid out in the precise, careful sequence that someone had kept for her without her knowledge for more than half a century. "My grade school," she said. Her voice had changed now. The evenness had something moving through it, something finding its way to the surface. "Greenway Elementary. There was a woman on the janitorial staff. She was there for years. She mopped the hallways and emptied the classroom trash cans, and the kids all walked past her like she was part of the building." Her breath caught on something. "We didn't see her. You know how children are. She was just there every day, in the background of everything." She picked up the photograph of the 9-year-old in the school line with hands that were not steady. "That was my mother," she said, "emptying my trash can." The words came out measured and slow, like something being carried very carefully across a long distance. "I walked past her every day for 6 years, and I never once looked at her face." Casey said she didn't want you to. That was the whole structure of it. She got to be near you, and you got to keep the life you had, and the price of that arrangement was that you would never know. Vivian set the photograph down flat with both hands and pressed it against the table and looked at it. Then Casey took the journal from her bag, the last one, the one with the worn cloth cover and the unsteady final entries, and she opened it to the back and removed the folded letter from where it had been tucked and placed it on the table in front of Vivian without saying anything. Vivian looked at the folded paper soft with being handled, at the small, careful handwriting on the outside. She unfolded it slowly. She read it. She read it again. She pressed it flat against the table the same way she had pressed the photograph, both hands, as if she was trying to feel the words through the paper. Casey turned and looked out the window at the bird feeder, and the sparrows and the plum tree, and gave the woman across the table the privacy that a moment like this requires, which is the privacy of not being watched while you take in the largest thing you have ever been given. After a while, she heard Vivian make a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughter, and was probably the sound a person makes when those two things are so close together they cannot be separated. Casey turned back. Vivian Marsh was looking at her across the tablecloth, her face entirely open in the way that some faces open when they have given up trying to manage what's moving through them. And in her expression was something so raw and so long delayed that Casey felt she should look away again. But Vivian reached across the table and took Casey's hand and held it the way people hold a hand when they mean it, not the polite contact of a greeting, but the grip of someone anchoring themselves. "All my life," Vivian said, and her voice was very quiet. "All my life I thought I was the one nobody chose. That was the story I lived with, that I had been the baby she put down and walked away from without looking back." She looked at the photographs on the table, and the whole time she was across the street. She was quiet for a moment. "There was a woman," she said, "at my grade school. I remember her now that I'm looking at this. Quiet woman, never spoke much, always working. She stayed for years longer than most of the staff, and then one year she was just gone, and nobody said why, and I never thought about it again." She touched the photograph of the school sidewalk with one finger. "I wonder how many of the places I lived in, how many of the towns. I wonder how many times I walked past her." "More than once," Casey said gently. "The journals have entries that go back through several cities. She took jobs near where you were." Vivian closed her eyes for a moment. "She never came to the door," she said. "No. She was afraid she'd ruin it, what you had, with your family." "I know." Casey squeezed her hand. "She says so in the letter. She thought she'd forfeited the right to be known to you, and she was afraid." Vivian opened her eyes. "She came so close," she said, "all those years of being so close." Ruth had carried that letter to the very edge and held it there, the stamp already on it, the address already written. A woman who had spent her entire life learning to stay back from the things she loved most had come within one step of crossing that distance and had carried the weight of almost crossing it for whatever years remained to her after that. It was not failure. It was the exact size of how much she had wanted to and how completely she believed she had lost the right. And then she told Vivian the rest. The forum post and Dr. Sylvie Crane and the legal question of the copyright. She told her about Miles Archer and his charcoal coat with his real love for the work and his $250,000 and his way of answering questions adjacent to the ones he'd been asked. She told her about the storage company's letter and the calculation of who has enough money to win a legal fight and who doesn't. She told her all of it because Vivian Marsh deserved the whole picture. It was, after all, hers. Vivian listened to the practical part of it the same way she had listened to the personal part, with complete attention and without interrupting. When Casey finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that made Casey understand immediately and completely whose daughter she was. "What I want," Vivian said, "is for her to be seen. Not the money, not the legal victory, not the chance to attach her name to something valuable. What she wanted was her mother seen." They spent the rest of the morning at that kitchen table. Vivian's daughter called at 11, and Vivian said she would call back later. There was something she needed to tend to first, and the word she used was tend to, which was a different kind of word than deal with. She made more coffee, and Casey called Dr. Sylvie Crane from the kitchen, and Crane drove up from Portland the next morning and spent 3 hours at the kitchen table with her white cotton gloves and her calibrated attention. And when she was done, she confirmed what Casey had already understood. Vivian Marsh was Ruth Calloway's daughter, and therefore Ruth Calloway's legal heir, and the copyright in every frame of the archive belonged to her, and any claim from any other party was substantially weakened by that fact, and would be further weakened by the story attached to it, which was not the kind of story anyone with legal counsel and a publicist wanted to fight in public. She said all of this in her precise, direct way, and then she sat back and said that when Vivian was ready, and only when Vivian was ready, she would very much like to help them figure out what to do with the work. The legal situation resolved in the quiet, almost anticlimactic way that legal situations sometimes resolve when the facts become clear and the math of public perception shifts. The attorneys for the storage company's parent franchise, 3 states away, went from aggressive to unreachable in the space of about a week, which was roughly how long it took for someone in their office to work out that the story they were proposing to litigate involved a corporation suing a 70-year-old woman for her dead mother's photographs and the 20-year-old foster kid who had found them and brought them to her. The attorney's call stopped. A letter arrived with language so careful and so distant from its original position that it barely acknowledged the original position had existed. Lyle Dutton came to the shop on a Thursday. He came without calling first, which Casey had learned was how Lyle operated when he was doing something he had to do before he could talk himself out of it. He knocked on the door, and when Casey answered, he held out a small cardboard box and did not quite meet her eyes. Inside the box, wrapped in a piece of tissue paper, was the silver-plated picture frame from Unit 44, polished to a shine that had not been there when she'd left it on the floor. The glass paperweight with the dandelion seed head. The bone-handled pocket knife, cleaned and oiled. "I kept thinking about what you said." Lyle told the space slightly to the left of her face. "About everybody calling it junk." He shifted his weight. "I wasn't the bad guy in this. I want to say that. I just wasn't in a position to be the good one when it counted." He looked at the box. "Figured I could at least not be the other thing." He left before Casey could decide what to say to him. She stood in the doorway and watched him back out of the parking lot and thought about the different ways people find to do the right thing and how most of them involve doing it sideways from an angle when they think no one is going to make them account for it or stay for the thanks. She kept the paperweight on the workbench. She put the knife in her jacket pocket where she found it sometimes with her hand when she was thinking about something, the weight of it solid and there. The frame she kept for a photograph she hadn't taken yet. Miles Archer came to the gallery the following week. It was Dr. Crane who had put together the space, a clean modern room in a building on the west side, that she had relationships with the kind of room that had good light and enough wall space to do what Ruth's photographs required. Casey and Vivian were there when Archer arrived, and Casey watched his face when he walked in and saw the daughter sequence laid out across one long wall. The chronological progression of a woman's entire life photographed in secret by the woman who had given birth to her. Something in his face cracked. Not dramatically, not in the way of a man who has been defeated, in the way of a man who has encountered something he was not prepared for and cannot quite integrate it fast enough to keep the professional surface intact. He stood in front of the photograph of the little girl behind the chain-link fence at the fair for a long time. He stood in front of the courthouse steps photographed with the tiny figure in the borrowed wedding dress. He stood in front of the pale yellow porch. When he finally spoke, he spoke to Vivian, and his voice was careful in a different way than it was usually careful. "I've handled 4 archives like this one," he said. "I've told myself every time that I was rescuing the work, giving it back to the world." He looked at the wall of photographs. "I never asked who the artist had left behind." Vivian looked at him steadily. Casey had come to understand in the weeks since Astoria an extraordinary capacity for steadiness. She had been holding herself together across a long life with the kind of quiet discipline that people don't advertise because they've never needed the credit for it. "The work is mine," Vivian said. "That's been established." "Yes," Archer said. He did not argue it. "What I'd like to ask," he said with something that was not quite his usual ease and was better for not being it, "is whether you'd consider working with me on the exhibition. On her terms, not mine. Her name on the wall, the full story. I'm good at this part, and I know the right people, and I can make the world see this the way it deserves to be seen." He paused. "I won't pretend I don't want to be part of it, but I understand whose it is." Vivian looked at Casey. Casey had learned in the weeks since the kitchen table in Astoria to recognize the questions Vivian was actually asking with her eyes, which were different from the questions she asked out loud. This one was, "What do you think?" Casey thought about Archer's phone calls and his $250,000 and the way he had answered the question about Ruth's name with language that was technically responsive and practically evasive. She thought about how easy it was to make promises in a gallery with the work on the wall and the story already told. She also thought about what he had just said. I understand whose it is. She thought about the specific weight of that coming from a man for whom understanding whose a thing is had always been a variable in a larger calculation. Her name on the wall, Casey said. Not a question. Ruth Calloway, Archer said. Every wall, every press release, every catalog, every interview. He met her eyes. I mean it. He kept his word. Casey watched him do it over the following months, which was the best kind of evidence. Every time a journalist tried to write the story as the story of the dealer who had discovered the hidden genius, Archer redirected them. He would answer questions about logistics and market and the business of the archive. And then he would say with a patience that did not seem performed, but the story is her, and point at the wall and say the name that needed to be said. There was something in him underneath the smooth professional surface that genuinely did not want to be the person who took this from her. The crack she had seen in the gallery, she came to think, was the crack of a man encountering his own better nature and finding it inconvenient and doing it anyway. Vivian did not want the money in the way that the money had been discussed. She was 70 years old with a paid-off house and grown children and a life that had already arranged itself around her own resources and did not require renovation. What she wanted was her mother's work intact, preserved and accessible to people who would look at it the way Ruth had looked at the world, carefully and without hurry, and see what was there. The archive went to a museum in Portland that Dr. Crane had spent 20 years building a relationship with, a place that had the storage capacity and the conservation protocols and the institutional commitment to keep the work whole rather than scatter it. Not sold, but entrusted on terms that Vivian negotiated with the museum's director over several long conversations at the same kitchen table in Astoria, where the whole of this had begun. With Casey sitting to her right and taking notes and occasionally saying things that Vivian later told her were the precise things that needed to be said at the precise moments they were said. The income from licensing and reproduction rights, which Dr. Crane managed, and which grew steadily as the work became known and then well-known, and then the kind of known that changes the way people think about something, went into a fund. Vivian had decided on the name before Casey had finished explaining what the fund would do. The Juniper Fund, she said, and her voice did the thing it sometimes did when she was using the word that her mother had used in secret for her whole life and never once said aloud. The Juniper Fund existed for one purpose. It provided first month's rent and a security deposit to young people aging out of the foster care system in Oregon and Washington, and it sent each of them a card handwritten by either Vivian or Casey, or both, that said the same thing Ruth had written in her letter, translated into language appropriate for someone who had just had a file closed on them, and a pamphlet about transitional housing handed to them in the world's expectation that they would figure it out. The card said, "Someone sees you. Someone looked, and they are still looking, and you are not what they forgot. You are what they kept." Vivian asked Casey to run it. She did not frame it as an offer that required deliberation. She framed it the way she framed most of the important things she had decided, as a statement of what was going to happen, delivered with the warmth of someone who has already considered all the objections and found them insufficient. "You're the only one who knows the road from the inside," Vivian said, "and she left the box to you, so let me leave this to you." Casey said yes. Of course she said yes. The shape of what yes meant was something she was still learning, still finding the edges of, but she said it without hesitation, because some things you do not need to deliberate about. Some doors you have been standing outside long enough that when they finally open, you do not stop to wonder if you should walk through. Her life changed the way that photograph prints change in the developer tray. Nothing and nothing and nothing, and then all at once, all of it present. She got an apartment 6 blocks from the shop, a walk-up over a dry cleaner with a window in the living room that collected the morning light in a way that she noticed on the first day and continued to notice every day after, the way you continue to notice things that you were not sure you would be allowed to have. She turned the closet into a dark room. It was too small for comfort and perfect for the purpose. Duke learned the route between the apartment and the shop and walked it without a leash, pausing at three specific corners to conduct olfactory assessments that he apparently considered non-negotiable. Clem let him in through the back when he arrived without Casey, which he sometimes did when he had decided the shop was where he preferred to spend the morning. And he would settle in the corner behind the counter and sleep with the self-possessed contentment of an animal who has arranged his life to his satisfaction. Casey's mornings went to the archive where she worked with the museum's conservation team, learning to be the work's keeper, printing Roost negatives one careful frame at a time to the standards the museum required, which were exacting and slow and suited her exactly. She had always been able to wait in the dark. Clem had known that before she had the language for it herself. Her afternoons went to the Juniper Fund. She sat across laminate tables in diners and coffee shops and the waiting rooms of agencies with young people who had garbage bags and closed files, and the particular expression of someone who has learned to need nothing because needing things is only useful when the things might actually come. She did not tell them everything would be fine. She told them the truth, which was that she knew the road from the inside, and it was hard, and they were on it right now, and that did not disqualify them from what came next. She handed them checks, and she gave them her phone number, and sometimes they called, and sometimes they didn't, and she kept going either way. Vivian drove down 2 Sundays a month. She and Clem and Casey and Duke ate at the shop workbench on mismatched plates from the thrift store 2 doors down that Casey had assembled one piece at a time over several weeks, looking for things with some life in them, and the meals were long and loud in the comfortable way of people who have stopped managing the impression they make on each other. Clem cooked badly and claimed not to care, which Casey had learned was his version of caring. Vivian brought things from Astoria bread and fruit, and once a jar of something she had put up herself, and they ate and argued about things that didn't matter, and sat in the warmth of each other long past when the food was gone. It was the first table Casey had ever sat at where no one was eventually going to ask her to leave. The exhibition opened on a Friday in November, the month after the Juniper Fund processed its first 4 applications, and the opening was the kind of evening that begins in one register and ends in another, quietly insisting on itself. The gallery was full of people who had dressed up for art and found themselves in room after room, slowing down and going quiet, the photographs on the walls asking more of them than they had budgeted for on a Friday night. The man in the rain, the children in the fire hydrant spray, the woman in the fur coat, and the man in rags on the same bench, leaning at the same angle, making one shape. The little girl at the bakery window, the old man with the newspaper for a blanket. Ruth Calloway's name was on every wall. In the last room, on a single wall by itself, blown up to a size that filled the space from floor to ceiling, was the 5-year-old girl behind the chain-link fence at the fairground's edge. The title card on the wall beside it told the story the housekeeper and the camera, the daughter followed across 50 years the storage unit, and the footlocker, and the woman who had found them. People read the title card and then looked at the photograph and then read the card again, and some of them stood there for a long time doing this, as if the information in the image needed to be processed in alternating turns before either of them would stay. Vivian stood in front of the photograph for a long time. Casey stood a few steps behind her and watched. There was nothing she needed to do except be there. After a while, Vivian reached up and placed her open palm against the surface of the print, against the glass, against the 5-year-old face that was her own face, against the chain-link fence, against the distance that her mother had stood on the far side of for a lifetime. She held her hand there and did not speak, and did not need to. Casey came to stand beside her, not in front of the photograph, but next to Vivian, in the particular position of someone who is there for the person rather than for the thing. After a moment, Vivian's hand came down from the glass and found Casey's hand and took it, really took it, in the same grip as the kitchen table that first afternoon. "You gave her back to me," Vivian said. She was still looking at the wall, at the little girl at the fence, at the distance across which love had traveled in secret for 50 years. "And you gave me back to myself somehow." A pause. "I don't know how a person says thank you for something that size." "You let me stay," Casey said. "That's how." Clem found her near the entrance an hour later. Duke was sitting beside her with an expression of diplomatic dignity, wearing the bow tie that Vivian had produced from her bag, and Casey had affixed to his collar with the specific type of embarrassed affection that is one of the better things about having a dog in your life. Clem stood beside her and looked at the rooms full of people moving slowly through Ruth Calloway's life's work. His eyes were wet, and he was doing nothing about it, which was its own kind of thing. "Your dead lady's famous," he said gruff about it, not looking at Casey. "She did it," Casey said. "I just developed the film." Clem was quiet for a moment. "Don't do that," he said, not harshly, just as a statement of fact. "Don't do that thing where you make yourself smaller than what you did." Casey looked at the rooms, at the photographs on the walls, at the people in front of them standing still in the particular posture of someone who has been stopped by something and has decided to let it stop them. A woman near the entrance was reading the title card beside a photograph of two elderly women on a bench outside a grocery store, both of them bent toward each other at the same angle, arrested in the middle of a laugh that had made them forget their bodies. "All this time," the woman said to the person beside her, "just sitting in a storage unit." Casey had heard versions of that sentence for months. The phrasing changed, but the shape stayed the same. The treasure sitting unrecognized in the abandoned space. The genius waiting to be found. She had her answer to it now. She had been working on it for months without knowing she was working on it, and it was ready. It was never about the storage unit. The treasure was not the photographs, not exactly, not as objects or as investment or as the art world's newest discovery. The treasure was the seeing. Ruth Calloway had spent 50 years looking at the people the world walked past, without slowing, and her looking was the rarest thing, which was the same thing it had always been worth everything, and belonging to whoever had the patience to find it. Casey stepped outside into the November night. The street in front of the gallery was wet from earlier rain, and the lights from the windows laid themselves out across the pavement in long golden shapes that moved when the wind moved the trees. On the bench across the street, under the umbrella of a streetlight, an old man sat alone with a paper cup of something, his coat pulled up around his ears, watching the cars go past with the settled attention of someone who has been watching things for a long time and has made his peace with what they do and don't add up to. He was the kind of man who existed in the margins of a Friday evening, the kind of man that 100 people would walk past before the night was over without a single one of them stopping to see what was there. Casey raised the camera, Ruth's camera. She had been using it for 3 months, learning its weight and its particular way of seeing, looking down into the hood instead of up through an eyepiece, the image appearing to her upside down and then resolving in her eye into the right side up world. It was a different kind of looking than anything she had done before. It required you to stop moving entirely. It required you to commit to the stillness and trust that what you were waiting for was in there. She waited in the dark behind the lens, the November air cold on her hands, the sounds of the gallery and the street and the distant river all around her. The old man on the bench shifted his weight. He lifted his cup and held it in both hands. Casey waited. He turned his face slightly toward the window of the gallery, toward the light coming from it, and for a fraction of a second, something passed across his features that was entirely his own, private and unperformed and real. The expression a person wears when they are alone and have forgotten to manage how they look. And she pressed the shutter. The camera did what cameras do. It kept the moment from getting away. The old man went back to watching the cars. He had no idea. He never did. But somebody was looking.